The constant noise of the city began to fade as the sun set, and the night brought with it a strange and uncomfortable sense of calm for Thomas Bennett. He had spent the day in endless meetings, dealing with anxious investors and demanding colleagues. As one of the youngest and most successful entrepreneurs in the city, Thomas was accustomed to the frantic pace of his life. However, that evening, something inside him urged him to take a different route home. He turned onto a quieter side street, a part of downtown that he would normally ignore. The yellow lights of the street lamps faintly illuminated the worn and empty sidewalks. Thomas walked in silence, lost in thought, until something unusual caught his attention. Sitting on the doorstep of a closed shop, a young woman wrapped in an old and dirty coat was trying to keep warm against the cold night wind. Her tangled hair fell over her shoulders, but even through the shadows, Thomas could see the beauty she possessed, something that brutally contrasted with the dirt covering her face and hands. There was a sad dignity in her eyes that met his for a brief moment before she looked away, as if accustomed to being ignored by those who passed by. However, Thomas couldn't look away. Something about her, perhaps the hidden strength or the mystery of her situation, made him stop. Thomas hesitated, but an invisible force pushed him to act. He approached slowly, aware that any sudden movement might scare her. When he was close enough to be heard, he crouched down, trying to appear less threatening. "Hi," he said softly, with a smile he hoped was reassuring. "Are you okay?" The young woman quickly looked up, surprise evident on her face. There was distrust in her eyes, but also something else, a quiet curiosity. "Why do you care?" she responded, her voice firm but with a trace of weariness. Thomas realized the weight of her words and struggled for a moment to find the right answer. He wasn't sure why he cared. Perhaps it was the shocking contrast between her beauty and her deplorable situation, or maybe it was something deeper, an unconscious desire to fill the growing void within him. "Because I can help," he finally replied, his voice full of sincerity. "I can offer you something warm to eat, a place to spend the night. It doesn't have to be like this." The young woman seemed to ponder for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read his intentions. There was something about Thomas, perhaps the honesty in his expression or the weariness he himself carried, that made her consider the offer. But years of surviving on the streets had taught Jennifer to be cautious. "I don't need charity," she said, raising her chin with unexpected determination. But before she could continue, something in Thomas's gaze made her pause. "I'm not offering charity," he said, straightening slightly. "Just a chance to talk, maybe help you in a way that makes sense to you." There was a long silence between them, a kind of silent standoff. Jennifer finally nodded almost imperceptibly. Thomas felt a wave of relief mixed with a strange excitement, as if he knew that this moment would change everything. "All right," she said finally. "But only because I'm curious." Thomas smiled, extending his hand to help her up. "I'm Thomas," he introduced himself. "And you?" "Jennifer," she replied, taking his hand with a hesitation that quickly disappeared. As they walked together toward a nearby cafe, Thomas couldn't help but think that the night, which had begun like any other, was turning into the start of something unexpected and deeply significant. The cafe that Thomas chose was small and discreet, one of those places where the smell of fresh coffee blends with the soft sound of low conversations. Jennifer, still reluctant, entered after him, her eyes carefully scanning the environment. They sat at a table in the back, away from the curious eyes of the few customers present. Thomas placed the order, but the atmosphere between them was far from relaxed. Jennifer remained silent as she waited, observing Thomas with a mix of distrust and curiosity. He seemed lost in thought, his expression serious and focused. Finally, he broke the silence with a question she didn't expect. "Jennifer, I have a proposal for you," he began, his voice low but clear. "And before you say no, I'd like you to hear me out." She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. A proposal? You don't even know me. I know, Thomas admitted. But there's something about you. I can't explain it, but I feel like I could trust you with something important. Jennifer crossed her arms, clearly skeptical, but gave a slight nod, indicating that he could continue. I have a charity event tomorrow night. It's a big deal, with many of the city's top names in attendance. And I need a date, someone who can pretend to be my girlfriend for the night. Jennifer blinked in surprise before her face closed off in a look of displeasure. You want me to pretend to be your girlfriend? Why? To show the world you're a nice guy helping a poor homeless woman? Or is it just so you don't look lonely among your rich friends? Thomas felt the impact of her words and realized that he had underestimated her ability to understand the situation. With a sigh, he leaned forward, trying to convey his sincerity. It's not that, he explained calmly. I know how this sounds, but I'm not interested in using you or exposing you in any way. In fact, I need someone who can help me get through the night. I don't want to be alone among those people, pretending that everything is okay. Jennifer studied Thomas for a long moment. She saw the truth in his eyes, something that made her hesitate. It wasn't just a matter of pride or dignity, there was something deeper. But the proposal still seemed insulting, as if he was underestimating who she was. And what do I get out of it? She asked, her voice cold. A night in a comfortable place, a decent dinner, and maybe a chance for something more, he replied. I'm not talking about money or favors, Jennifer. Just an opportunity to change things, at least for one night. She remained silent for a time, considering the proposal. Pride told her to refuse immediately, but a part of her, tired of the constant struggle, saw this as a chance. Perhaps, just perhaps, accepting this offer could open a door to something she didn't even know she wanted. All right, she said finally, still with a hint of distrust in her voice. I'll go, but don't expect me to pretend to be something I'm not. And don't think this means I owe you anything. Thomas nodded, a barely perceptible smile touching his lips. I never thought you did, he responded. And with that, an agreement was sealed, an agreement that both knew would change their lives in ways neither could predict. The hotel ballroom was filled with glamour and sophistication, with crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and elegantly decorated tables spread throughout the room. Jennifer, dressed in a simple black dress that Thomas had provided, felt out of place. Every detail of the environment seemed designed to exude wealth and status, something she had never experienced before. As they moved through the ballroom, Thomas by her side, Jennifer felt the curious and, in some cases, condescending glances. However, to her surprise, no one seemed to question her presence. On the contrary, people greeted her with respect, as if she were a natural extension of Thomas. There was something about his confident posture that made others believe in the image he had created for the night. They sat at one of the main tables, where the most prestigious guests were gathered. Thomas exchanged cordial words with each one, introducing Jennifer as his date with a naturalness that left her even more disconcerted. But as the minutes passed, Jennifer began to realize that the others' attention was not focused on her but on Thomas himself. There was an almost reverent respect for him, something she did not expect. After dinner, the ballroom lights dimmed, and a stage at the back was illuminated. A master of ceremonies took the stage, announcing the much-anticipated moment of the night, Thomas Bennett's speech. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Thomas began, his voice firm and clear, echoing through the silent ballroom. Tonight, we gather not only to celebrate but to remember. To remember those we've lost, those still fighting, and those who, unfortunately, did not have the same opportunities as us. Jennifer watched attentively, feeling a tension grow in her chest. There was something in the way Thomas spoke that captivated her, a raw emotion she had not noticed before. My mother was one of those people, he continued, his voice slightly trembling. An incredible woman who dedicated her life to taking care of me after my father passed away prematurely. She was strong, determined, and never let me see how much she suffered. But when cancer struck her, she didn't have the chance to fight as she should have. The diagnosis came too late, and the treatments she needed were out of our reach. The room was in complete silence, all eyes fixed on Thomas. Jennifer felt a pang of pain in her heart as she heard those words. She recognized that pain, the despair of seeing someone you love suffer without being able to do anything to help. That's why I created the Living Hope Foundation, Thomas continued, his hands trembling slightly as he held the microphone. So that no one else has to go through what my mother went through. So that everyone, regardless of their financial situation, can have access to early diagnosis and proper treatment. So that more mothers, fathers, children, and friends can have a chance to fight and win. He paused, and Jennifer noticed that his eyes were shining, holding back the tears that threatened to fall. At that moment, she knew that everything she had thought about Thomas was wrong. He wasn't just a rich and powerful man, he was someone who had turned his pain into something positive, into a mission to help others. When the speech ended, the ballroom exploded in applause. Thomas descended from the stage and returned to the table, his expression now serious and thoughtful. Jennifer, still processing what she had just witnessed, couldn't help but look at him differently. "You did this for her," Jennifer said softly as he sat down beside her. Thomas looked at her, surprised by the understanding in her voice. "Yes," he replied simply. "All of this is for her. But it's also for all the other people who didn't have the same chance. I couldn't save my mother, but maybe I can save others." Jennifer felt a wave of emotion wash over her. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel hope, not just for herself, but for what the future might bring. As the dinner continued, Jennifer and Thomas remained seated at the table, wrapped in a conversation that, for both of them, seemed to disconnect from the luxurious environment around them. The sound of clinking cutlery and laughter in the background faded away, leaving space for a deep and revealing dialogue. "So," Jennifer began, her voice softer than before, "did you always know you wanted to do something like this? Create a foundation, help people?" Thomas hesitated for a moment, pondering his response. "Not always," he admitted, picking up his wine glass but not drinking from it. "At first, I just wanted to escape the pain. I threw myself into business, anything to distract me from what I was really feeling. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more the guilt consumed me. I was failing to do something meaningful in my mother's memory, failing her." Jennifer nodded, deeply understanding that internal struggle. "I've had to deal with guilt too," she confessed. "Guilt over wrong choices, paths I took. But unlike you, I didn't do anything good with it. I just survived." Thomas observed her closely, noticing the shadow of sadness in her eyes. "Surviving is already a victory, Jennifer. Especially with everything you must have faced." She gave a sad smile, touching the edge of her glass. "Maybe. But surviving isn't enough. I wanted something more, you know. I had dreams, plans. I wanted to be an artist, live off my art. But life had other plans for me." "An artist?" Thomas asked, his interest piqued. "What did you used to do?" "Paint," she replied, her eyes momentarily shining at the memory. "I love the feeling of creating something out of nothing. Seeing the colors blend, the shapes emerge. It was the only thing that made sense to me, that gave me peace." "And why did you stop?" Jennifer sighed, feeling the weight of the question. "Things changed. My mother got sick, and I had to make choices that weren't exactly what I wanted. But in the end, life on the street took everything from me. The paints, the canvases, everything was lost." Thomas felt a tightness in his chest as he heard this. He knew the weight of difficult choices, but what Jennifer had faced seemed much crueler. "That doesn't mean your dreams are lost forever," he said, trying to offer some comfort. "Maybe it's possible to recover that. Who knows? You still have so much to offer, Jennifer." She looked at him in surprise, not used to hearing words of encouragement. Before she could respond, one of the event organizers approached, asking Thomas to greet some guests. He nodded, but as he stood up, he extended his hand to Jennifer, a silent gesture inviting her to join him. As uncomfortable as she still felt in that environment, Jennifer accepted. At Thomas's side, she found a new confidence. Together, they went to the group of influential people waiting to speak with Thomas, and to her surprise, she was naturally included in the conversations. As they moved from group to group, Jennifer began to feel a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. Thomas made a point of including her in every conversation, introducing her with respect and even a certain reverence that made her feel, for a moment, as if she truly belonged in that world. Finally, the event came to an end, and the guests began to disperse. Thomas and Jennifer said their goodbyes, and he gently led her to the exit, where a car was already waiting for them. The cold night enveloped them again, and Jennifer felt a slight shiver as she left the warmth of the ballroom. "It was easier than I expected," she admitted as the car began to move. "You were wonderful," Thomas replied, his eyes fixed on hers. "I knew I could trust you." Jennifer smiled, a genuine smile that hadn't surfaced in a long time. "Thank you for believing in me," she said sincerely. When they arrived at the hotel, Thomas accompanied her to the reception, where he had reserved a comfortable room for her. Jennifer hesitated for a moment at the entrance before turning to him. "I don't even know how to thank you for all of this," she began, but Thomas shook his head, interrupting her. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "Believe me, you've done more for me than you can imagine." They stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them growing in a way that both felt but neither was sure how to handle. Finally, Thomas took a step forward, lowering himself slightly so that their faces were close. Jennifer felt her heart race but did not pull back. The kiss that followed was gentle, a careful test of what was forming between them. It was brief but charged with emotions that neither had the words to express. When they pulled apart, both were slightly breathless but also smiling. "Can I see you tomorrow?" Thomas asked, almost like an insecure teenager. Jennifer nodded, still speechless but knowing that she wanted more from this man who seemed to understand her pains and hopes so well. "Yes, I'd like that," she finally replied. Thomas smiled, a smile of relief and hope. "Then I'll see you tomorrow," he said, slowly backing away as if he didn't really want to leave. Jennifer entered the room, closing the door behind her but not before casting one last look at Thomas, who was still standing in the hallway, watching her. He waved slightly, and she returned the gesture, feeling strangely at peace. Jennifer threw herself on the soft bed, something so different from what she was used to. As she stared at the ceiling, her heart was still racing. The connection she had felt with Thomas was real, and it scared her. It wasn't just gratitude or physical attraction, it was something deeper, something that made her desire a future she thought she could never have. However, there was also fear of trusting someone, fear that this small spark of happiness was only temporary. She knew that her past, her present, were still inseparable parts of who she was, and that could complicate everything. As Thomas walked back to his own room, he couldn't stop thinking about Jennifer. She had touched something in him that had long been dormant, a need for true connection, for something more than material success and superficial achievements. The kiss they had shared was more than a gesture of affection, it was a silent promise that there was more to explore between them. But he also knew he was venturing into unknown territory, and there were risks involved. He felt a responsibility for Jennifer, but at the same time, He knew he needed to give her the space to decide for herself. The cloudy sky seemed to weigh on Thomas as he followed Jennifer through streets that became increasingly deserted and grim. A sense of unease began to take root deep in his stomach, growing with each step she took. He could hardly believe that the same woman with whom he had shared such a significant moment the night before was now leading him down such a dark path. The city around them seemed to change as they advanced. The bright lights of corporate buildings gave way to narrow, poorly lit streets, where shadows were more prominent than people. Thomas continued to follow Jennifer, keeping a safe distance but close enough not to lose sight of her. Something was definitely wrong, and he was determined to find out what it was. Jennifer finally entered a narrow alley, disappearing into the shadows. Thomas hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest as he pondered whether to continue. The place reeked of danger, but his determination to uncover the truth outweighed his fear. He moved silently, positioning himself where he could see what was happening without being noticed. Inside the alley, he saw Jennifer talking to a group of suspicious-looking young men. Thomas frowned, his body tense as he watched the scene. She seemed nervous but determined, her posture revealing that this wasn't the first time she had been there. The young men, clearly unconcerned, exchanged glances with each other as Jennifer spoke with one of them. Thomas couldn't hear what they were saying, but he noticed when one of the guys pulled something out of his pocket, a small bag. He handed the package to Jennifer, who in return gave him some cash. The transaction was quick, almost casual, but for Thomas, it was an absolute shock. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. His mind tried to find a rational explanation, but none seemed to make sense. Jennifer, the woman with whom he was beginning to form such a deep connection, was involved in something illegal, something dangerous. He felt a mixture of anger, disappointment, and above all, intense concern. As soon as the transaction was completed, Thomas stepped forward, anger winning over caution. "Jennifer," his voice echoed through the alley, filled with incredulity and pain. Jennifer froze, her entire body tense at the sound of her name. When she turned and saw Thomas standing there, her face crumbled into a mixture of shock and shame. The young men, realizing Thomas's presence, quickly scattered, leaving Jennifer alone to face the situation. "Thomas!" she murmured, her voice choked, her eyes shining with held-back tears. She couldn't hold his gaze for long, returning to stare at the ground as if the weight of shame was too much to bear. Thomas approached slowly, trying to control the anger and disappointment that threatened to explode. "What do you think you're doing? How could you get involved in this, Jennifer? You're risking your life." Jennifer looked at him, the pain in her eyes almost tangible. "You don't understand," she said, her voice weak but firm. "I had no choice." "No choice?" Thomas repeated incredulously. "Jennifer, you're selling drugs. How can that be your only option?" She swallowed hard, her eyes full of tears that now began to fall. "I know how it looks, but do you really think I wanted this? That I chose this path because it was easy? No, Thomas, you don't know anything about what I'm facing." Thomas remained silent, still struggling to process what was before him. Part of him wanted to believe there was an explanation for all this, but the image of Jennifer in that alley, making that transaction, continued to haunt his mind. Jennifer took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "If you really want to understand, then follow me. I'll show you why I'm doing this." Thomas hesitated for a moment, but the desperation in her voice made him relent. He nodded silently, and together they left the alley, walking through increasingly dark and quiet streets until they arrived at a hospital. Jennifer led him to a more secluded and quiet wing, where the lights were softer and the atmosphere was filled with the weight of hope mixed with fear. They stopped in front of a room, and a nurse who recognized Jennifer immediately stepped out. "Miss Jennifer," began the nurse, her voice gentle but concerned. We need to talk about your mother's treatment. If the payment isn't made by the end of the week, unfortunately, we'll have to stop the treatment." Thomas felt as if the air had been knocked out of his lungs. "Jennifer, your mother, is she here?" Jennifer nodded, her eyes finally meeting his, now full of tears she could no longer hold back. "Yes. And I didn't know what else to do, Thomas. I lost everything trying to pay for her treatment. My house, my job, everything is gone. And when there was nothing left, I ended up on the streets. And now the only thing I had left was to do whatever it took to keep her alive, even if it meant losing myself in the process." The revelation hit Thomas with a devastating force. The image of Jennifer as a desperate woman, but still fighting with everything she had to save the only person who mattered, shattered every certainty he had formed about her. He couldn't find words for a moment, just staring at her, absorbing the weight of her words. The judgment that had burned in his mind was replaced by deep compassion and understanding. Without hesitating any longer, he took a step forward, holding Jennifer's face in his hands. "Jennifer, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice broken by emotion. "I had no idea. But now that I know, I want to help you. I'll help your mother. We'll find a way to get through this together." Jennifer broke down in tears, and Thomas held her tightly, knowing that from this moment on, her struggle was also his. He was determined to do everything he could to pull Jennifer out of this darkness and help her find a new path, a path where she wasn't alone. The comfortable silence between Thomas and Jennifer, now full of mutual understanding, was broken only by the soft sound of their footsteps as they walked down the hospital corridor. Jennifer still felt her emotions on the surface, but there was a new sense of hope, a sense that maybe things could really get better. When they reached her mother's room, Jennifer paused and looked at Thomas, who offered her a reassuring smile. She took a deep breath and opened the door, entering the room with Thomas following. The room was simple but well lit, with sunlight filtering through the light curtains. On the bed, a frail-looking woman was sitting, reading a worn book. When she saw her daughter enter, a smile lit up her tired face. "Jennifer, dear," she said with a soft voice full of affection. "What a nice surprise." "Mom, I want you to meet someone," Jennifer began, feeling a slight nervousness as she introduced them. "This is Thomas. He's been helping me a lot. Thomas, this is my mother, Helen." Jennifer's mother, despite her frail condition, raised her eyebrows in an amused expression. "Oh, I know what it means when a young woman introduces a man to her mother," she joked, her voice choked with joy. "So, Thomas, are you Jennifer's boyfriend?" Thomas laughed, feeling warmth in his chest at the lightheartedness of Jennifer's mother, even in the midst of her difficult situation. "It's not official yet," he replied, casting a fond look at Jennifer, who blushed slightly, but were heading in that direction. Jennifer smiled, touched by the way Thomas handled the situation. The moment was so simple yet so full of meaning. They sat by the bed, and the three of them talked for a few minutes, discussing trivial things, allowing Jennifer's mother to forget her situation for a moment. However, the lightness of the conversation was interrupted when Jennifer's mother, with a more serious expression, held her daughter's hand. "I heard the nurses talking," she began, her voice filled with concern. "They said the treatment will be stopped because we can't afford it anymore." Jennifer lowered her head, the pain evident in her eyes. Before she could respond, Thomas intervened, his voice firm and confident. "Mrs. Helen, please don't worry about that anymore," he said with a reassuring smile. "I am the owner of the Living Hope Foundation, which fights against cancer, and we will ensure that your treatment continues. The foundation will cover everything necessary." Jennifer's mother was silent for a moment, the shock clear on her face. Her eyes filled with tears as she tried to process what Thomas had just said. Are you serious?" How can I ever thank you for something like this? Thomas gently held her hand, his gaze full of empathy. You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Helen. In fact, it's the least we can do. After all, you're the mother of the foundation's newest director. Jennifer was left speechless, completely surprised by what Thomas had just said. Her mother looked at her, also surprised but with a proud sparkle in her eyes. Director of the foundation? Jennifer, is this true? This is new to me too, Mom, Jennifer replied. Thomas looked at Jennifer with a calm smile, and she, still processing everything, turned to him. Thomas, since when did you decide that you wanted me to be the director of Living Hope? He met her gaze with seriousness, but there was a genuine warmth in his eyes. Since the moment I understood that you were risking your own life to save your mother from cancer. That kind of courage and determination is exactly what I want in the foundation's leadership. Someone who won't stop at anything to do what's right. Jennifer felt a lump in her throat, gratitude and emotion overwhelming her all at once. Thomas, I don't know what to say. I never imagined that. I could be part of something so important. You already are, Thomas said softly, holding her hand. You are already a vital part of this. Thomas pulled her into a hug that sealed not only what they had built so far, but also what they would come to build together. They didn't need more words at that moment. The road ahead might be difficult, but now, with each other by their side, they knew they could face anything. Months passed. The sun shone gently through the windows of the hospital where Helen was sitting with a contented smile on her face. The treatment that once seemed like a distant dream was now a reality, thanks to Thomas's intervention. Every day she showed signs of recovery, her health improving slowly but steadily. Jennifer visited her mother regularly, bringing with her not only love and support but also news of her new life and the impact she was making with the foundation. Under Jennifer's leadership, the Living Hope Foundation flourished. The tireless work of Thomas alongside her transformed the organization into a vital force that helped hundreds of people get the treatment they needed to fight cancer. The foundation not only funded medical care but also offered emotional and logistical support, ensuring that no one faced this battle alone. Jennifer and Thomas, now married, became a symbol of hope and resilience for many. They continued to work side by side, guided by a common mission and a love that had grown and strengthened through adversity. Together, they had found a greater purpose, one that transformed lives daily, including their own. As they walked hand in hand down the hospital corridor after another visit to Jennifer's mother, both knew they were just at the beginning of a journey that would continue to touch and save lives. They had found what really mattered, not just in their work but in each other. And so, with hearts full of gratitude and a bright future ahead, Jennifer and Thomas moved forward, ready to face any challenge that came their way, confident that together they could overcome anything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.